Now, these guys in the United States, this Continental Congress, is putting into place ideas that the Europeans are dealing with as philosophy and ideas. For example, speaking of imperfect guys, Francis Bacon is a British writer and philosopher. He is an absolutely remarkable and brilliant man who has a serious impact on the modern era. We are indebted to Francis Bacon. A lot of modern science could not exist without Bacon's ideas. As a person, Bacon's a bit of a flake. He's not exactly the perfect example of normalcy and balance. However, as a scientist and a writer, Bacon is absolutely brilliant. He gives us a number of things. One thing he gives us is the modern scientific method, what we call the Baconian method. Now, if you remember your days back in junior high school and high school in your science classes, you may remember writing lab reports. Remember the joys of lab reports? Yeah. You had to come up with a hypothesis and phrase your hypothesis, basically what you thought was going to happen, the expected outcome of the experiment. Next, after you came up with your hypothesis, you had to then perform a series of experiments. You had to perform them under very specific conditions. You had to record all variables and conditions. So in other words, if one test was recorded with like 0 wind speed, the next test was recorded with 5 mile an hour wind speed, you had to record and document everything about the situation. Then you evaluated the data, factoring in variables such as temperature, wind speed, environment, all that kind of stuff, and based on the data you then drew a conclusion. That concept of hypothesis, test, control, and conclusion comes from Bacon. He is the first one to really establish a set process to determine a scientific outcome based on a repeatable process including all controlled environmental requirements, data, and so on. He's the guy who really sets up the modern scientific method. Without Bacon, we would not have that methodology, that way of doing things. Bacon also proposes something else, a word that you should know: utopia. The concept of utopia is not new, but Bacon is one of the first ones to create a new concept of a utopia, which is going to be written about by hundreds of authors over the next 100 years or so. The word utopia literally means no place or nowhere, and utopia is the idea of a perfect world, in this case set up on the concepts of the Enlightenment. The idea of utopia is the idea of being able to create or establish a perfect world in which everything runs according to those natural laws. Nothing defies natural laws. Every person is guaranteed natural rights. It is a perfect place, a perfect world, where all things are right and as they should be. Over the next, like I said, 100 to 200 years, a number of authors are going to write about utopias. They're going to create their versions of a perfect world and dream of what a utopia would look like if one could truly be created. None of those utopias are actually doable. They're not feasible. They are dreams. They are no place. They are hopes and ideals of what a perfect world would look like if it were possible for us to truly create one. Now, one of the other great minds and scientists from this time period is someone else that you know. You may not know he looked like that, but this is Isaac Newton. Now, one of my all-time favorite student answers, somebody wrote about Isaac Newton, and I said, okay, who's Isaac Newton? What do you know him for? And they said, oh yeah, Isaac Newton, he's the guy who invented gravity. And I laughed my butt off. Why? Well, think that statement through. Isaac Newton invented gravity. Okay, so if he invented it, it didn't exist before? So like before Isaac Newton, people just floated? No. Isaac Newton did not invent gravity. In fact, Isaac Newton did not come up with a concept of gravity. Long before Isaac Newton, people knew that when something fell, it went down. That was not news. The larger concepts of gravity, though, what we call the laws of gravity and the laws of motion, like, for example, the orbits of the planets being caused by the pull of gravitational forces between massive bodies like the Earth and the Moon. Oh yeah, that's Newton. Newton comes up with a system of mathematical equations, a system of physical laws that no one else had actually come up with before. With Newton, it is not any single concept or law that makes Newton so innovative. It is the fact that Newton put together concepts and laws that other people had suggested, hypothesized, conceived of before, but they all kind of came up with them separately. No one thought of putting all those concepts and those laws together and looking at them as an overall system. So in other words, Newton is the dude who says, there's a relationship between gravity and the reason that when you roll a child's toy with wheels on it, it doesn't keep going forever. There's a reason that it slows down and stops. And that reason is related to the same exact thing that makes the moon orbit around the Earth. Really? Yeah, really. And Newton's the guy who actually puts those concepts together. And he's actually the first one to create a system. Interestingly enough, for the record, side note, Newton is not a deist. Most people believe that the world is just a great machine that God put together and then let run. That's the definition of a deist. That's what most of the guys at the Continental Congress, that's what many scientists at the time are. They simply view God as the master mechanic doing all this from afar. Newton doesn't. Newton actually has an incredibly complicated, very personal religious belief system, but Newton again goes for a system where all things are interrelated and work together. Now, the way that this Enlightenment thought expresses itself is through this idea of natural rights, natural law, this concept that human beings are meant to have a say in the way that they're governed. Now, the problem is, of course, that most of Europe is still run by monarchies, and so this American experiment is viewed as a little wild and crazy. There is a desire for republics, for people to have votes, for people to choose representatives, for there to be a freedom of government. However, that idea seems kind of newfangled, wild, crazy, stupid to a lot of people. And there's a desperate need to establish this idea as not being a crazy fly-by-night idea. People want to establish that these Enlightenment ideals actually trace their roots all the way back to classical ideas, back to the world of Greece and Rome. What they want to say is, hey, Plato wrote a book called The Republic. Rome was originally a republic. These ideas of natural law, these ideas of the world being run by giving rights to individuals, these ideas of people having a say in their government are not a new crazy fly-by-night. They're simply an improvement, a new scientific way of looking at ideas from ancient Greece. To emphasize that connection between the classical, the Greek and Roman world, and this new enlightened world, art turns back to a classical Greco-Roman way of portraying things. Gone are the fluffy ladies and fat puffy babies and huge mounds of pink puffy flesh we had in Rococo. Instead, more and more art is going to connect with classical values and a classical sensibility and way of showing the world. For example, a fellow you may have heard of by the name of Thomas Jefferson. When Jefferson designs the Capitol for his home state of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson actually sends his architects to Greece and to Rome to look at the buildings and the structures in Greece and Rome. Jefferson wants to make that connection between the way the Greeks and the Romans did things and the way that the Americans are doing things. He wants to emphasize that the American Republic is not a crazy experiment of something that's never been tried before. Instead, he wants to connect the American experiment to the Greek way of doing things. If you look at the details of the state capitol, you will see that Jefferson is trying to recreate a Greco-Roman government building. He's got that triangular pediment above the columns, just like a Greek or Roman temple. He has curlicues on the columns, Ionic capitals, something that takes us back to the style of Greece and Rome. Jefferson is trying to draw the connection, to create a neoclassical, a new version of classical art, to connect with the ancient world. In some cases, like this Capitol building, that's very highly successful. In some cases, it's not so successful, frequently embarrassingly not successful. For example, behold, Washington enthroned. We're going to connect Washington as the father of America to Zeus as the father of the gods. Epic fail. Yeah. Actually, the problem is that most people in the 1770s and 1780s have the same exact reaction to it that you just did. They look at Georgie all buffed out in a toga and they crack up. It's pretty much a failure. It actually originally was on the lawn of the White House and it gets moved because people stand around, laugh at it, and throw eggs at it. It's currently on display in the Smithsonian and it still makes people look at it and go, what the heck? Actually, the what the heck is neoclassicism. It's the idea that they're trying to connect the American founding fathers to the Greek and Roman founding fathers. They're trying to connect America and the United States to the original republic, to Athens, to Greece, and to Rome. The idea is a sound one. The idea is a good idea. The problem is the actual execution doesn't work for us because we're Americans and we tend to think that connection is a good idea, but don't put our founding fathers in togas. No. Now, this whole idea of the connection, glorifying the ideas of the Enlightenment is great, but on a practical level, the people who really support this idea, the people who are interested in this American experiment, are predominantly the French. Now, the French are very interested in the ideas of intellectualism, the ideas of the Enlightenment. The French pride themselves in the 1700s on being the most elegant, the most intellectual, the smartest people out there. And because of that, they are very, very interested in talking about debating the ideas of the Enlightenment and ultimately in trying to discover exactly how this experiment is going to work out. They're fascinated by these ideas, and they basically are interested in exploring this new experiment as long as the exploration happens 3 months away across the ocean in America. Now, part of what fascinates the French about this American experiment is the fact that it's based on Enlightenment ideas, and partially the fact that the French love the simple. They believe that the best people are the simple people who live simple lives. Remember Marie Antoinette and her little shepherd garden? Yeah, they love that junk, okay? Because the French are fascinated with this American experiment, they bankroll it. And part of their interest lies in the fact that they are intellectually interested in what's going on in America because they have a lot of problems back home. France is becoming an increasingly troubled country. Just as they're encouraging the Enlightenment and encouraging this new American experiment overseas, back home, they're struggling with poverty, with a monarchy who is increasingly disconnected with the lives of the common people, and with an anger that's growing in the common people, a discontent with their rulership and their leadership. That discontent rises from the way that the French see their government. The French are very deeply steeped, as are the Spanish, the Italians, in this concept of the chain of being. That the king is actually a different creature than normal people. The king is literally higher on the chain of being than everyone else. They believe that the king is actually a higher level of being, specially blessed by God, and the actions of the king are above the actions of ordinary people. They really believe that what the king does is directly related to the well-being of their nation. They view the king as having what we call a sacred bond with the people. They believe the king can actually heal diseases because he's blessed by God. This is a stupid, simplified way of saying it, but they see the king almost like a lucky rabbit's foot. They see the king as deserving to be treated in a special and sacred way. They view the king as at the top of the food chain, blessed by God. Nobles and intellectuals are also given special gifts, but they rank below the king. Perhaps the best way I can explain this is to tell you a quick true story. During the French Revolution, Louis the 14th, the grandfather of Louis the 16th, had moved the palace away from Paris and out to the Palace of Versailles. We'd already talked about that. In doing that, he took himself away from the common people of France. And the common people of France became deeply resentful because they felt that they had lost their personal connection with the king. He had gone away to Versailles and left them. They didn't see him as often, and there was a growing resentment against the king for leaving them. During the French Revolution, the common people believed that they need the king back in order to make their country a better place. Think of it that they want their lucky charm back. They want their magic back with them because they believe that that will help stop the economic problems, stop the famine. I know that sounds silly to us that a king would do that, but they really believe this, okay? They actually march between 3 and 4 hours out to the Palace of Versailles. They actually march across the countryside to the palace. They kill the guards and kill the servants at the Palace of Versailles. The Queen, Marie Antoinette, wakes up in the middle of the night to the screams of the dying guards. She gathers her children and runs to the bedroom of Louis XVI, utterly panicked. She says, "They're killing the guards. They're coming to kill us." And Louis stands up and says, "No, it's okay. Why are you afraid? They're just coming to see me. They just need to reassure themselves that their king is okay." And Louis XVI opens the door to the people who just killed his guards. Now here's the fun part of the story. When Louis does that, and I'm not kidding, this is a true story. When Louis does that, the people who murdered the guards, who walked 4 hours to get to the palace, come in and they kiss Louis's ring. They touch him. They weep and cry because they've found their king. They put Louis and his family on chairs and they carry them on their shoulders 4 hours from Versailles back to Paris, excited and happy that they have the king again. We think that's nuts. That's how they view their king. They trust their king. They trust the magic of the blessing of God on their king to make their country a good place. The problem is, in the 1770s, that faith is beginning to break down. They're beginning to no longer believe that the king can save them. And the king who is stuck with the fallout of that decision is Louis XVI. Louis himself is a troubled man who doesn't really want to be king. Louis actually wants to be an inventor when he grows up. He has a hidden room filled with broken clocks and little machines. He wants to invent things. He doesn't want to be king. He doesn't want to be stuck with his job, and yet he is. His wife is also not originally a very good queen. His wife is Marie Antoinette. Now, Louis and Marie Antoinette become a good king and queen as their reign goes on. The big deciding factor for Marie Antoinette is actually having children. She's an excellent mother, and ultimately she gives a great deal of money and a great deal of her personal time to try to help out orphanages and help out poor children. But by the time she reaches that point, it's too late. Too much damage has been done, and the people already have a concept of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette as heartless and cut off from them. The sacred bond of trust between the king and his people has been damaged, and that damage is irreparable as those people begin to rebel and begin to challenge the authority of the king. And in 1789, the revolution that began in America based on the ideas of the Enlightenment spreads, and a similar but very different revolution breaks out in France. And the French Revolution begins and then continues to take a terrible toll on the city of France and on the concept of revolution and of enlightenment.